Start by talking about analysis specifically in the context of peer research. So why does analysis differ? So it's slightly different to traditional research where you'll get a policy team or experts or professors, they take the data away, interpret it and write the report. Peer research is very specifically looking at how do you upskill young people, and those young people are the peer researchers who have gone out and designed the data collection methods. They have gone out and collected the data, and they have a sense of ownership over that data. So it's very, very much the way that they should be also responsible for analyzing it, interpreting it, and writing it up as well. But it's not just an ownership ethical side of it, it's also good research. So young people using their lived experience through that analytical lens can see different patterns, they understand different contextual clues. Language is a big one, understanding the way in which young people use different words or language and what the subtext is behind that. We will have an example where we'll have a peer researcher having a conversation about their local park, and they'll be able to do really interesting follow-up questions because, like that young person who also lives in the area, they know the park off by hand. So they can point out certain things and they can go into a lot more detail within the interview. Same applies within the analysis as well. They can relate and understand the contextual clues. Second one is about power not slipping back to adults. And I think it's really good to see lots of products getting peer researchers involved in the design of interview guides, doing the interviews. But then when the data stage comes, you can see kind of wrestling back of power back to practitioners and adults about what they think the most interesting key findings are, or what they think is very surprising to them that young people have said. It's really, really important. And the distinction is with all of this is that young people interpret the data, and practitioners, the role is to prepare it. And we'll talk about what preparing means. The next one is about the authority of the peer researchers. So this is why it's so important to have the recruitment of young people of the lived experience that you're researching, so they have that authority to do that interpretation, right? Hyper local. It's really difficult for a peer researcher who lives in Barnet to interpret the findings of interviews of someone living in Manchester, right? Completely different context, and they lack that authority. So you really need to make sure that peer researchers are in the room, but also the ones with the correct experience. What we always say with analysis, and this goes to traditional analysis as well, it's any system that has a structure to it, right? Which is great because it enables you to be a bit more flexible and creative when you're coming up with these workshops about how you approach it. There'll be certain things that are good standard, especially around quantitative analysis. There's stuff that statisticians do around crosstabs and correlation and significant levels. And, if you put it into a formula, is it significant enough to include it? There are some kind of rules around that. But especially with qualitative and creative, and even the way that you approach quantitative, you can kind of do it in any way. The way that we always say to young people is analysis is any kind of structured way of condensing, recapping, interpreting the data that you can argue logically. So if the peer researchers can explain the approach that they take into the analysis, they understand why they've taken that approach and they can communicate that, then actually it's quite open to how you do it as long as you have a clear and consistent structure from the beginning. And then lastly, just to repeat again, preparation by adults, but not interpretation. And this is really tricky because it can be a little bit leading, right? You kind of see a really interesting point, you think the peer researchers should pick up more, so you kind of take them down that avenue. And it's really challenging to kind of not do that sometimes. The data process analysis process is pretty simple, right? Defining the purpose, like why do you need to do this data analysis, right? Why can't you just give the stack of papers of interviews or the bar charts, right? If you're doing a survey, do you need to do a data analysis, or do you just get all of the bar charts and give it to whoever you're trying to influence? What is the actual purpose? Why do you need to condense it? Is there additional information hidden within it, subtext or within the interpretation or cross-referencing, right? Why are you actually doing it, firstly? Not just because it's a part of the steps that you feel like you need to take, but what are you actually aiming to achieve through the way that you're going to work on the data? Second one is collecting that data from different sources. And we're not talking about field work. It's more just actually that preparation, right? So downloading it off Typeform or Google Docs, it's getting it off the recording devices or phones or whatever it is. Third one is that cleaning, right? And that's the preparation. How do you make clean anonymous transcripts? How do you make sure the data isn't just this giant Excel sheet, right? How can you start creating bar charts or graphs so young people can easily read the data? Then you start analyzing it, whatever that form it takes, and then interpret results and apply them. This is the slide that we use when we're talking about young people. We really need to do an introduction. It's really important you give a full grounding about data analysis and why we do it. This is actually from the CIA, which is a bit of a strange example, but we talk through the CIA as this big spy agency or whatever it does, but they do the same thing to data. They process it and they analyze it. So whatever the operational environment is, we ask young people, how do they collect data? What data do they collect? And, young people will be like, they're listening in, they're listening to our phones, they've got our WhatsApps, right? But that's the point. They get this vast amount of data. And I go, well, if you've got all of the WhatsApps, that's a huge amount. Are they going to read every single one? No, they have to process it and exploit it. And you talk through what that looks like. How would you process your WhatsApps to spy on you? What are the keywords that you would search? How would you go about getting 2-3 years of conversations with your best friend and summarizing it into some information? So then you break it down to information. Then the next lens is analysis and production. So the information would be you use the word, vibes like 160 times within 4 weeks. What does that say? And what's the intelligence that we're gaining from it, right? And with all of this, when we're teaching data analysis, it's always talking about almost like a cone. It's how do you go from a lot of information into a small amount of intelligence, right? Can I summarize these 60 pages of interviews with staff members and come up with one key point, right? If the person you're trying to influence is asking you, what did you find out? You would say, we interviewed 60 staff members. And the one thing that came away is they need the youth club to be open past 5 p.m. till 7, right? Like they talk about it in a range of ways. They said hundreds of words about it, but what's the one key intelligence point, right? It's about that summarizing and distilling of data into something valuable. So we always do a 3-stage analytical process with them, and this goes across all the different types of data. Describe and illustrate, and it's this data literacy thing. Like, what does it literally say? Give me the percentages. What's the actual quote, right? What are they saying? And what do you think they're saying? And what's the quote to back it up? Really the basics, right? It's the literal meaning of it. The second one is condensing and the recapping. So how do you start to put things together, start to group things, put them in a basket, put them in themes or sub-themes, right? And then how do you start to recap as well? So if I said, what was that young person's experience of CAMS? You can summarize the 20 pages into, generally negative. They had one positive experience because of this, but that was the exception. And their negative experience is largely dominated by this, this, and this, right? How do you start to condense and recap? And then lastly, it's evaluation. So once you've condensed and recapped and you have a bit more of a smaller pool to work on, it's okay, but is it validated, right? Like, what does it actually say about our research question? How confident are we in it? Which ones are outliers? Which ones are anomalies? Is the key finding surprising? And then starting to be critical about the limitations of that data as well before you go on to start thinking about, okay, key findings and recommendations, what are we asking for? It's always making sure that at the end of this analytical process that you have a space for the peer researchers to reflect on whether it's valid or not. They might do all of this great work, and then at that reflection, they go, well, actually, we've only spoken to 2 young people, and their results are quite surprising, and I'm not sure that they're typical. We need to go back and do more interviews or whatever it is. So next one is in terms of preparing data for analysis. Very, very similar. That funnel, we talk about organizational data and preparation, data reduction, and then the analysis interpretation. So organizations will create transcripts from audio files or interviews. You might generate a report with all of the data. It's really important that organizations, before young people have seen it, review it. And by that, I mean they read all the transcripts, make sure it's correct. AI can be quite funny, especially if the recording is bad and accents are strong, right? So making sure that it all goes through and it's all correct before it even reaches the young people. And then you do that data reduction. So content, thematic analysis, further analysis, and then reflections, then themes, which is a kind of way of grouping it, and then key findings, which is that kind of definitive list of 5 or 10 things that you really want to communicate from all of the data that you've collected. In terms of what practitioners prepare, so I've talked about the transcriptions, and we talk about making sure it's anonymized, don't have our names on it. How do you do that in a way that is not too time consuming as well? Survey data preparation, really simple graphs. Some platforms do it for you, but if not, it's about making sure that you have really simple graphs. If you've got older groups of young people, you could show them the crosstabs, like the Excel sheet crosstabs, but then they have to do a lot more mental maths. But I think that's a good process to see how we've arrived at certain things. Visualizations are really good as well. There is a balance between visualizations and not being too leading, right? So you might want to get a word cloud put all of the transcripts into a word cloud and see what comes up. And then just give that to young people without any kind of leading or bias. Not, hey, look at this, isn't this really interesting? Just the more ways that you could show them the data they've collected in different formats, the better, right? And they can make a judgment on whether it's valid. Creative materials as well, especially if there's creative approaches to research. It's about making sure that all of those are labeled, scented, printed, time-stamped as well. And digital also really, really works because then they can all see it really clearly on their phones and zoom in and stuff. But actually, a nicer way is to put it all in a space, like a gallery space for them to look at. And then session materials. So blank questions, spreadsheets, flip charts, making sure they have materials to go into groups. And then lastly, the most important thing, not removing data. So we provide peer researchers with every single bit of data. It's overwhelming sometimes. You need to spend a lot of time on analysis. The only thing that we exclude ever is within quantitative survey data. And we only exclude it if it isn't statistically relevant. So for example, if we look at the correlation between how men answer the question versus women answer the question, we won't include that crosstabs if we don't find it being statistically significant, right? So preparation of data, there is a little bit of what some people would consider data analysis, where you're doing some crosstab work and you're doing some statistical tests and p-values and things like that. It's a bit complicated, but it depends on your sample size, right? And I think there's a judgment there about percentage difference and margins of error. And I think practitioners should do that work and understand what those things mean and what it means to prepare a quantitative data sheet for statistical significance before you give it to the young people. Because if the young people say, hey, young women answered this question 15% more than young men, therefore young men and young women differ on this, and this is one of our key findings, they won't know that it isn't statistically significant or it's in the margin of error unless you teach them through that. And I don't think we've ever seen a project where young people are taught statistics and SPSS, right? It's not something that we've seen done generally. So preparing interview data, there's a range of ways of doing it. I mean, 10 years ago, this is how I did it, right? Staff manually doing it, typing. My typing speed is very, very fast, but it was the bane of my life. And it would take 3 to 5 hours per hour of audio. If you're a really fast typer, it's about 2 hours for every 1 hour, but typically 3 to 5. Peer researchers as well. It's a really good thing for them to do and practice, but I always find it's incredibly draining, incredibly laborious, takes too much time. We may get them to transcribe their own interview as well, especially if it's 20, 30 minutes long. But we're seeing less and less projects do this. What we're seeing more of, especially recently, is AI and auto transcription. It's built into Teams, it's built into Zoom. Chat models are really quite good at it now as well. And actually, you can still involve staff and peer researchers to check it and then make sure it's a clean transcript and listen to it through, which is a much quicker process, checking an AI's work than necessarily doing it yourself. So the majority of it is now just done by AI, I think. There are professional transcription service, 1 to 2 days, and they charge by minute of audio. I think it's particularly useful if you're in a pinch and you've got, like, say, a focus group with 7 young people and it's too chaotic and AI is not doing a good job and you don't have the time. That's what those specialist services are really good, because they're super, super accurate, but they're very expensive per minute. So if you've got a really problematic, chaotic 20 minutes, that's what they would do beforehand. So anonymization as well. So replacing names with codes, listening to identifiers, remaining identifying information, addresses, family members, employers, school names, whatever it is. You will analyze it before the young people see it, right? You as an organization have a duty to make sure all of that information is kept private before the peer researchers see it. Um, and then also document what you've done as well. So we do a raw version, we do a clean version, and then we make sure that we're putting down when it was cleaned and what was removed and things like that, just so you can keep a track of it. But I would also always keep the raw version, at least for a couple of weeks, just to make sure in case there's any issues as well. So that's kind of standard and very GDPR. And But now moving on to actually how do you involve those young people in analysis, right? And I'll start with quantitative analysis because that's probably the most common one. This is one of the slides, and we talk to young people, and again, it's all about upskilling, so teaching them about quantitative analysis. They already understand the difference between quant data and qual data because you've done that previously in the research design. But then analysis, the two that we kind of teach really basically descriptive and inferential, right? So descriptive is that really simple side of it. It's the means, medians, and modes. Going back to secondary school, what does it mean? Talking about percentages, frequencies, range. It's the absolute numbers and it's kind of the literal what do you see? Like what's the number, how many, what percentage, right? That's the basics. Inferential analysis is the correlation regression or the analysis of variance, right? So it's a little bit more complicated. You might be putting two things together and seeing the gap, and you're starting to make inferences. So you're starting to almost hypothesize what the relationship is between two data points. And we teach it really simply first, right? So we talk about favorite flavor of ice cream, and it's that really simple one of, what's boys' favorite ice cream versus girls' favorite ice cream? What's their least favorite ice cream versus the girls' least favorite ice cream? But then you start to get them to look at percentages differences, right? So one question you could throw out, which is a bit of a qualitative one, is who is pickier by nature, boys or girls, right? Who is more strongly opinionated, boys or girls, right? And then it's kind of up to the young people to answer that question and describe the way in which they came to that conclusion. So, for example, they might say, well, I think boys are pickier. And you go, why? And then what they're trying to get to is the variance of difference. So men are very likely to have a strong opinion about mint chip, only 8% like it, while 40% like chocolate. While girls across the board, all of the different choices are closer to an average, which is around 25%, right? So really strongly opinionated for vanilla and chocolate, strongly opinionated against mint chip, while girls are a little bit more across the board average, apart from strawberry, right? So how do you ask questions that are a little bit more complicated than biggest number, lowest number, right? What's the difference between strawberry and for boys and girls? It's twice, right? Twice as many girls, double the percentage. It's all those different ways of how can you read, describe the data, and how can you make inferences on it. And then we do a slightly more complicated examples. So this is the fun one, which we always start off with, which is what percentage of people in America think they could beat various animals in a bare unarmed fight. 72% think they could beat a rat. 61% think they could beat a goose. 6% still think they could beat a grizzly bear in an unarmed fight, right? And it's always a fun one because you get to talk about, which different peer researchers think they could take which different animals in a bare unarmed fight. But really the point of this is the data that sits behind it. So this is the same data, except they asked it for American men and women and British men and women. And it's getting them to look at the range of variations. So the question is which do men, American people and British people most vary in their opinion on, right? So actually you can see the biggest line, the longest line is for goose. There is a huge variation in goose. And then you explain why. Like, why do you think there's such a variation in perceptions around geese, right? Where are geese native to? Who has more stories about geese? And you bring them to the kind of more qualitative cultural point where, Britain is famous for having crazy geese attacks old woman by village square stories, right? So I think inherently in this country, we grew up with far more media exposing us to the frightening dangers of geese. While America, less so. Maybe they're just like, it's a big duck, right? I don't know. I'm just speculating. But it's trying to get the data points. What's the percentage difference? And then the additional inferences, what's the difference between men, women? What's the difference between American men British women, and why are those existing? And why is it for certain animals? Why is it for less? Right? And you can see the range of variation goes down, the more dangerous the animal becomes. There's a lot more open for subjective confidence and opinion when it comes to geese and medium-sized dogs. But once you start getting to lion, grizzly bear, and gorilla, that massively narrows because the perception of whether they could beat it, it's no longer a confidence thing, right? Like everyone's like, oh yeah, lion, I'm doomed, right? There's only 2% difference there. So you start off with as many examples of surveys, and YouGov is great for this. Lots of polling data out there. Get them to do it on kind of fun, inconsequential graphs with really high fidelity data with really good crosstabs, right? Before you even get them looking at your data. For them to do with the data itself is how you get them to think about descriptive statistics, so frequencies, counts, averages, that's the basic, right? We usually get them to write it up as a sentence. So we will give them a graph and we'll say, describe this graph in a sentence. And I don't expect them to go, 12% said this, 14% said this, 16% said this, 18% said this, 40% said this. It's what is that one key takeaway? So they'll go, well, 72% of people said agree or strongly agree that we need more LTNs or whatever it is, right? So already they're getting the descriptive statistics and they're starting to even collate and condense further. They're not telling me every single data point on the graph. They're starting to condense it into one sentence, right? And what we tend to do with graphs and tables is we give them everything and we get them to describe what it shows, how it means, what surprises them, and then we also try and get them to group it. Cross tabulations we include as well. Those aren't in graphs. They will be like the ice cream example, just a literal Excel with the percentage points. That needs a little bit more mental maths. What's the gap of variation? What does it mean? And why do you think it means that, right? What's the numbers that you're putting behind it? Also, what's missing, right? So if you're doing a piece of research on active travel and you've got all of these data points, but none of them mention cycling, that's the thing to think about now, right? What's actually missing from here, right? What did we forget to include? What did we not capture? And also, which questions have low response rates, right? You might have a branching question where, have you had experience of mental health services? And if you say no, you don't get a bunch of these questions, but then you find only 2% of your sample said yes. So you might have these fantastic graphs that say really strong things like we hated CAMs, but it's only 2% of a sample of 100. And therefore, it's not worth printing out the graph. We still print out the graph and show it to them, but then it's about teaching them why do we have to discount this graph compared to the others? Is what's the numbers behind it? And that's part of evaluating data quality, right? It's thinking about the sample size again, question design issues. If something surprised them, is it surprising because it's a really good, interesting, insightful finding, or does it surprise them because the question was wrong and actually it forced people to answer in a way that they might not have if it was designed in a better way, right? What's the demographic gaps as well, and all of that side of it, right? It's always doing that reflection of data quality. So the breakdown of it is to familiarize with themselves with it. How do you familiarize yourselves? You can lay it all on table. What I tend to do is we do a quiz, right, where the closest answer in the room to the actual graph data gets a point. So you go through every single graph in the survey and get them to guess what they think young people are going to answer. And then, some of them will guess wildly wrong, and then you explore why they did their answered really wrong and why it surprised them and things like that. It just helps familiarize themselves with it and gamifies it slightly. The next one is describing that data. So writing it down, how would they write it? How do they summarize it in simple language? Next one is interpret it with their lived experience. And this is really important. Like, why is it surprising to you? Do you agree with what they're saying? How would you have answered? Why do you think they've answered how you've answered, right? We'll have care experienced young people less likely to approve of cycling lanes or whatever. They're more likely to approve of personal car usage. You in the room who's got a car, why do you use it? Why do you think you would say it, right? How do you interpret those results with their exact lived experience? Then condensing and sorting, and that's grouping. This is why it really works when you can print out everything on a table and move it around. Then we get individual ranking. So what we tend to do is we get each peer researcher in a room to do their list of 10 or their list of 5. What's the 5 most important graphs or pieces of data or key findings on the table in the room, and how do you order it? And then we have a discussion about, okay, what are all the 10? What's What's the ones that keep coming up across all of our 10? Those are clearly the most important. What's the other ones that different people have chosen, and why did you choose this one versus this person who chose that one, right? And then that leads you already into the key findings, right? How do you come up with a collaborative, collective agreement on what your 10 key findings are from the quantitative analysis? And I always think it's good by the end of the analysis to have 10 key findings from the survey, right? That you've all agreed on. And you can fit data points within it. Not one graph has to be one key finding. You can combine 3 graphs into one key finding, right? So, young people said that they do not want to cycle around the borough because of fear of theft, right? You might have one graph saying they don't want to cycle, another graph say the barriers to cycling is theft, and you put them two together to make one key finding. But having 10 or 5 key findings by the end of this is important. So this is an example of it. So as you can see, the pages in blue are literally just the graphs that we exported from the survey platform. Really, really simple. And then the gray, black and white ones is the cross tabulations that we have run using SPSS. And we've only printed out and included the ones that are statistically significant, right? Are valid given our sample size. And we put it all on a table. And as you can see, what they've done is they've written down under each one, especially the crosstab ones, what does it say? Like, what does it mean, right? And you can see in highlighter within the tabs themselves, they've started to highlight the variance. They might have written in the margins the percentage difference between them as well, just so they really can look at any single one and they can understand it immediately, right? Because not every single peer researcher will go through every single graph or crosstab. They're all doing it at the same time and they can kind of see each other's work. And the next thing is to sort it, right? So we put the post-it note here, and that post-it note there on the yellow says getting involved. They stick it down, and then all of the survey data that relates to youth voice or influencing policy change or getting involved in consultations, that goes under there, right? So all of the survey questions around transport, whatever it is, and you can start to move it around. And the idea of it is data analysis. It's about showing how your interpretation of data, your condensation of data, and your grouping into key findings it isn't this kind of like formula. It is a fluid, organic thing based on their judgment. So they will group it, and then actually they might realize this grouping about transport has so much. It's got like 20 different pages, and then this grouping on crime has like 2, right? Maybe the transport one is too much. Can we break it down into sub themes, trying to make all of the different groups feel more weighed, right? Make sure they're kind of even, thinking about maybe this theme is too simple, this one is too broad. And then also, how do you organize it going across the table so it also tells a story, right? What's the first theme that you start with? What's the last theme, right? Contextual setting, problem setting, more detailed exploration of those individual issues. And generally at the end, you end with all of the data around what do they want to see going forward, that future looking side of it, right? But it can be anything. How do you get peer researchers in the analysis stage to start organizing it, to start thinking about what's the story of the data? What's the story I want to tell and how does it tell it through the numbers, right? And that's a really nice visual way of doing it. We give some general advice with quantitative as well, what to look out with and what they should ask themselves and why it helps them trust it. The first one is just size of difference or effect size, right? What's the difference between 40%, 60%? We always say a margin of error should be kind of 5% or so. But that margin of error could be greater. If you've only surveyed about 40 young people, the margin of error might be like 20%, whatever. So kind of think about what your margin of error is. You can Google margin of error sample calculators. So if there are 10,000 young people in the area that you're looking at and you survey 200, you can put those in and it will give you a margin of error confidence level on Google. But just getting young people to look at the size, right? And getting them to disregard percentage point differences and looking for the really big gaps and big differences, right? So it's less to be likely random noise. So the confidence band as well. So it's always looking at that margin and then weighing it up against confidence band, like plus or minus 5%. That's how you do it. And this is partly related to enough people in the sample, right? So did you ask enough people for it? And did you have certain people answer certain questions? Does it narrow down even more? Straight line story, it's basically do all the numbers like add up, right? Do they tell the same story? Are they consistent across multiple questions as well? It's if they grab a piece of paper and they're saying, this is one of the key findings because it says this, I'll say, great. What other graph here supports that, right? Like how do you start building a story from more than just one graph? What are multiple data points that help you trust what you're trying to assert? And then the common sense check, right? Like, does it make sense? Like, is it what you're hearing, right? Does it relate to you and your own lived experience? Are you surprised by it? All of that stuff. That stuff's most important for peer researchers. That's why their lived experience is really good, because ultimately it is just their common sense, their experience, checking the results as you go along. So this is another one where we start to move into key findings, and they can do it in a range of ways. You know, most young people in the house project have a helpful facilitator, blah, 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 blah. And what they've done is they put a star, circle, and square system. So they put their key finding, what they want to say. So most young people found their facilitators to be great, blah, 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 blah. And then they've gone back to the data sheets and they've starred every single data point that speaks to that, right? So another way of kind of starting to group it and also providing supporting data. This particularly works well when you're combining qualitative and quant as well, because then you can star a graph here, you can star a quote from one of the interviews over there, and then you could start to collate a range of different data sources into formulating some key findings. And then, as I said, it's all about connection to stories, right? So quant data can always be very numbers orientated. That's why we practice getting young people to write it up in clear language, right? I try and get young people to write it up in fractions rather than a percentage. So they're not saying 66 or 64%. It's getting them to think about what does that actually look like? 2/3, 1/5, half, whatever it is. Those more illustrative language when it comes, like fractions are just more descriptive and they paint more of a picture than percentages. So getting them to, even in the way that they're writing up the data, using language that kind of creates a bit more of a story or a visualization in people's head, right? And then we always use quantitative data really as how you kind of put the grounding in, and then the quotes go on top of it, right? So number provides the headline, it's always the what, and then the qualitative data is the why, right? And the two are inseparable, which is why we always recommend people do mixed data. So 68% of young people did not have a good experience of this. That's it. And then what are the quotes from the qualitative that kind of build into it and explain it and provide that kind of story and that humanity of it. And then also identify where numbers and stories contradict each other. And they do quite a lot, right? Like what does the survey data say? And then how is it contradicted by the interview guides? And then why is that the case, right? They're not problems to solve. Nothing's gone wrong, right? It's more about the nuance and the contradictions that people have within themselves, and also the framing, right? If you frame it a certain way, they're more negative. If they sit and think in a conversation for 5 minutes about their actual experience of a staff member or whatever it is, then they tend to be more positive, right? So it's not always a problem. It's a interesting thing to be explored. And then lastly, patterns, right? What are the patterns that you want to do additional qualitative? And the quant data doing the analysis first is great, right? Because you can either do more interviews if you haven't finished that yet, or do additional focus groups, right? So lots of projects will do the survey first, complete it in the first 2 months. They'll do the analysis, the survey, and they use that analysis to inform the interview guides, right? And then the interview guides will be so much more detailed, because then you're going to talk to someone at a local authority, an interview, and go, so we did a survey of 500 young people who live locally. They said this. A percentage of them said this. Why do you think that is the case, right? And it's getting others to interpret the data or respond to it. And it's a really powerful tool for making qualitative research better. So second one, talk quickly about involving in qualitative analysis as well. And again, you could do this at the same time, parallel. We usually spend a whole day on quant analysis and a whole day on qualitative, but you can do both at the same time on the same day if you have lots of not pizza food that will keep people awake. The core concept of it is, I mean, we have content analysis, we have thematic analysis. The main part that I want to kind of talk about is coding. So coding is where you get young people to basically tag different items, and it could be words within a quote, whole sentences, entire paragraphs, but it gets them to tag it and to summarize it and condense it. So if I go, what is that paragraph about? I could see what it's about by how the young person has tagged it. Loneliness in NHS or whatever it is, right? And then once you have all those codes, you start to collate them into themes. And I'll talk about what that looks like a bit more. One basic one is also just doing golden quotes. Like you might want to give them a yellow highlighter, and you say that yellow highlighter is your golden highlighter, like the golden buzzer from Britain's Got Talent. Only use it sparingly and only use the golden highlighter for quotes that 100% you think should go in the final report, right? It's a way of getting them to also pull out stuff for the report and also gets them even within the coding to really prioritize, right? Here's all the stuff that I think is interesting and we should analyze in here, but here's a quote that says so much and should definitely go into the report and is really important. Also outliers, getting them to reflect on whether their interview guide was different. You might get 6 young people having one experience and 1 young person having not that experience. And they will only know that young person is an outlier if they have a full discussion with all the other peer researchers about what their young people said. Content analysis and thematic analysis are slightly different. The way that we tend to describe it is content analysis is the actuality. It's like the literal, like what was actually said. How many times was the word bad used? Have they actually used the word lonely or scared? Have they referenced a park or a service? What's the literal content of what they're saying, right? And you can turn that into quant data really easily. 67% of young people reference Burgess Park when talking about things they like in the area, blah, 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 blah. Thematic analysis is the really important bit and is the harder bit, but the really great bit for peer researchers to be involved in, which is what are the underlying themes of what people are saying, right? They may say a service is bad, but what are the themes on why they explain how? Is it waiting lists? Is it staff experience? Is it travel or darkness? Whatever it is, right? What's the actual subtext of what's going on? So similar again with this, what is the key finding? And then what does it mean with stars and circles? I think I've used this example before. So let me show you this one instead. This is another visual example where we got them to do the transcripts and they started to code them. So as you can see, they wrote their codes in brackets sometimes. So they put this sentence is mental health. They highlighted this one and they said it was about femininity equals specialization, whatever it is, it's the points, and they all code it very, very differently. And then what we do is we get them to cut it up. Who doesn't love scissors and paper and sticking, right? And it's the same thing as the quant data analysis. They condense the interview guide into meaning units. So what's this sentence that has meaning? What's this paragraph that has meaning? What does it mean at a glance, right, in terms of the codes? And then how can we arrange it, right? So this one is mental health impact. And every single young girl who had a quote or something that they read that has something to say about mental health impact, they put it in that one space, right? And then you have it on a huge table. And suddenly you're categorizing 5 hours of conversations with 10 young women into some of the emerging themes and how it speaks to the research question. Again, it's kind of a visual activity. And it's a good way of breaking it up because otherwise it could be really overwhelming. Like qualitative is so much harder in that way, right? Like in quant data, if you do a survey, you'll have like 15 graphs, which are colorful and really simple. The similar thing is like a stack of 60 pages, it's like 20,000 words. So it takes a lot more time. It's a little bit more complicated. And the more kind of visual creative ways that you can get them to break it down and move it around, the better, because otherwise it's just too stodgy. And you're not expecting every peer researcher to read it, right? That's the difference. With quantitative data, every peer researcher has the time to read every graph and understand every graph. You and a lot of projects will not have the time for every peer researcher to read every single transcript. So generally we assign 2 transcripts per young person. Maybe we'll get each transcript to be checked and double checked by one person extra, but they will not be reading all the transcripts. There just never is enough time to do it. I think it would be good if there was though, but it would take like 3 days. That's the only challenge. So yeah, then they organize it in strips. They have a discussion about it. They check others' work. They go, oh, this is interesting, but I don't think it belongs here. It should go here. Then you'll find that the second column has way too many things again. So again, how can we split it down? How can we be a bit more complicated? And again, what's the story that it tells from left to right narratively? So when we do a qualitative workshop, it's that first one of familiarization. So reading all of the interviews, we just get them to read it. No tasks, no jobs, no pens, no pencils, just to read it quietly and just absorb it. Then coding, we tend to get them to code in pairs rather than individually because it's just quicker and they can have a discussion about the codes as well to verify it as they go along. So each pair gets one transcript and they go through it, they come up with codes for all of it. Third one is code grouping. So how do you group all the codes and the quotes together? Collecting the codes and examining frequency. So how many people coded X quote mental health, right? And then you can collect that. And then you say, well, there were 65 codes of mental health, um, more than any others. So majority people talked about mental health in these interviews. Five theme exercises. That's the kind of condensing it again. So what are the five biggest key themes that came out of this, right? And they can have sub themes in them, but what are the five themes that people talked about? And then evaluate and refine it, right? So how does it answer the original research question? And I would always, for every analysis session, regardless of what data you're analyzing, have the research question written down in the room somewhere, right? Everything in terms of why is this interesting? Why is this important? Why is this surprising? Always has to be in reference to the original research question. So this is what we teach young people really quickly, just to give a visual example of what coding is. So we'll have the transcript text example. So where do you get support for your mental health? Person says, oh, I'm not sure, I guess. So I'd go to my families and friends first, people I trust. I was going to ring up the NHS or something, but my friend went ages ago and is still waiting to see someone, blah, blah, blah. The point is with codes, it's very subjective, right? They can code it in a range of ways. One young person might code it as uncertainty, one person, friends and family, trust, NHS services. One person might literally highlight every two words and then put every single quote in there as well, which is a really detailed and complex way of doing it. But it's getting the sense that it's okay if people see different things in it. That's why we get more than one person to code a transcript. And actually, subjectively, you will all see different things in it. And actually, that's part of the strength of it. There's no wrong or right approach. Then what we do is we get them to kind of list all their codes, right? So we have a discussion like what all the codes that you identified. And one person says they identified uncertainty and then they used uncertainty a lot. One person said not sure, then they used not sure a lot. One person said don't know and they used don't know a lot. Then actually, are they just synonyms of each other, right? Can we just get all of those codes across these four peer researchers, across these six transcripts? And can we just make the theme uncertainty? You've all picked up on the theme of uncertainty. You know, one person might say waiting lists, nobody talked to, didn't help. What's the theme that kind of collects all of that as well, right? And again, it's this thing of turning 10,000 words into 40 different repeated codes, then 40 different repeated codes into like 10 key themes. Then from those 10 key themes, you're getting to that one overarching theme. Like, what's the overall takeaway? And then how do you review it, right? So you go, like, you've read all the interviews. These are our five key themes. This is the number one thing that we found out from it. How important are they to our research question? Do they accurately represent what we've read? Have we missed anything? And if there's any issues, then you kind of go back to the drawing board, to the table, and then rethink about themes as well. So practical approaches, I mean, it's really tricky to do coding and loads of projects do it differently depending on how much time and capacity they have, right? One way is, I mean, people always use hashtags because, I mean, I feel like it's slightly outdated now, but I think hashtags are a good way to immediately grasp the concept, which is like, how would you hashtag this sentence? What is this sentence about in a single word, right? And you want to move young people to using single words. The danger is that they use whole sentences, right? So they'll go mental health, waiting list, blah, blah. That's not a code. It really has to be one, maximum two words. That's what we limit them to, because then it's way easier to condense it. Also, we do practice texts. A really good practice text to code is politician speeches, because politician speeches tend to be really filled with subtext and meaning, and they have a purpose of what they're saying. So particularly the first speeches that prime ministers make outside number 10, we get Rishi Sunak's one that he did when he first entered number 10 and get them to code what does it mean and what is he trying to achieve in it, right? If he's talking about challenges, why is he talking about challenges? You know, if he says the word, I'm going to be honest with you, what is that implying, right? Like it's getting them to think about the meaning of the literal content of what he's saying, right? Do it on a small exercise as a group first, before you get them to do the transcripts. Thinking out loud, really, really important, gets them to just read out aloud what they say, how it's said as well, and then how it makes them feel, whether it makes them feel sad, whether it makes them laugh. Usually reading transcripts are really, really funny, especially from teenagers as well. So it could be quite a fun thing to do. Inter-rating coding. So again, this is when you get two different people to code the same transcript section and then compare. So why did they do something different? And then getting them to reflect on that kind of interpretation and that richness from doing it differently. And then using lived experience as a code, right? So really getting them to think about their own experiences, their own history, if their care experience, their understanding of how the care system works in their local authority, getting them to really think about that and reflect on that as a tool to understand the text that's in front of them or the conversations that are being had, right? That's the key, right? It's their insight of systems or spaces or places or education or whatever it is that can give you that additional analysis and that additional interpretation that professional adult researchers find it harder to do. So there are quite a few examples of practice. So Education Explorer, they use the quote wall approach. So they put all of the meaningful quotes on a wall and then they sorted them and it took 4 hours, right? Again, visualization of quotes. Groundwork London, they coded a transcript from a recent politician's housing speech, right? Again, they take 45 minutes, but it builds that skill. And again, it's a really good text to do that with. London Youth and Volunteering and Civic Action used a narrative analysis. And narrative analysis is a bit like a thematic analysis, except you're asking, like, what's the story here, right? Case studies are a really good example of narrative analysis, where they're telling a story about a certain project or a certain young person's outcome. But then how do you write the story of that participant? So if someone did an interview, instead of coming up with codes and coming up with thematic analysis, instead another simple exercise is read the interview and can you summarize his journey in 200 words, right? Tell a story from that interview, different way of doing it. Hackney Council cross-coded 18 interviews and then used a shared coding framework as well. And notice the peer researchers from different postcodes coded the same safety language very differently, right? So they provided a shared coding framework. And that's easier to make it less complicated. So, you would say, instead of coding it whatever you want, you say, if there's anything around uncertainty, write don't know, right? So you're not having people say, I don't know, I'm not sure, uncertain, they don't know, signposting, making sure you have a shared language when you're doing that coding work could make it easier. But then obviously you have to make sure that the framework captures everything because otherwise you're steering it in a certain direction. Right, quickly, I'm just going to talk about analyzing creative data. Again, I've separated creative data out, but typically creative data is kind of seen as more qualitative data, right? But the way it's applied with young people is usually very, very different, but the analysis is a bit more similar to qualitative. So they're not just illustrations for report, is what we say. They are real data, and how do you make sure that you're treating it like real data and have a structured way of analyzing it? One way that people do it is a gallery walk. And I love walks for things, tree walk, park walk. If you want to analyze a park, get them just to walk around it and make observations. If you get a bunch of young people to make pieces of art on a research subject, put it up along the wall and have the peer researchers walk through it as a gallery, and you stop at each thing and then you make notes about how it makes you feel, what colors are being used, their observations about the artwork, just kind of experiencing it in that way, kind of more like the art history thing of like, how do you break down an image and what does it mean? Sorting and clustering, I feel like I'm going to keep saying this again. How do you sort and cluster different images? Which ones are dark? Which ones are light? Which ones speak to a certain subject? Reoccurring symbols and metaphors. Again, it goes back to art history there about like, what's the repeated symbolism that you see in it? Do we keep saying buses, public transport? Are people happy or sad? What's the repeated things across multiple pieces of work, right? Captions and quotes as well. And I think this is really important, right? Capture the young people reacting to the art in the moment as well. Don't get them to look at it, think about it, and write it down. How do you, the best practice is to record it almost like a focus group, right? Have the recording as you go around the gallery and get them to react and record their first time reactions to that work and what it means. And also get quotes from the people making the artwork. So the really nice one is not just collecting the artwork, but also collecting a quick interview with the person who did it about why they did it, why did they choose those themes and things like that? Because then their explanation of what they've done, it tells you so much as well. And then making the meaning together. So getting all the young people to think about it collectively and then not getting adults to interpret it or steer it. So this is one where they had a river scene and they put certain bits of meaning towards it. And this is what the peer researchers did. They stuck things on, they created things, crafted things, but it's a very long piece and you can stick it up on a wall, right? And actually people start from the left and they go through it and it takes them through a journey onto the right side. And it's a really nice long piece that people can walk through and you can examine it foot by foot, right? In a single space. And each side is so packed with meaning and little symbols and symbolism, and there's repeated things as well. It's a really nice one to do. The difficulties look like translating it, right? So we always say, what's the key takeaways from it? Like, what are the core messages from it? Against a little bit like qualitative stuff, like what are the key themes that come out? What piece of artwork goes on it? There's the personification of data as well. So if this set of images could speak to a decision maker, what would they say? Getting them to kind of, in their own words, talk about what they think the data says. Creating creative pieces of evidence as well. And again, it's that stack. So you start with the survey, you have the qualitative, and then you have a creative piece. They all stack together and can all speak to the same point if selected carefully and correctly. Explore tensions with other data as well. People's artistic interpretations of things will be very different to how they answer a survey, how they answer an interview, just being conscious of that and exploring why there is a difference there. Generally, young people tend to be more positive and opinionated in creative approaches. And then plain language summaries, just making sure that you understand an interpretation of that artwork by a peer researcher in plain language, right? So even if you couldn't see the image, you kind of understand what it is and what it means or what it's thought to mean. And then lastly, consent. And this is before, make sure that all of the consent for all of the artwork is collected because it's really important to include in the final piece. So this is a really good example as well. What are the key themes? What do you see? What do you think it's telling you? And how is it telling you that? So they'll say something about the environment and how can we tell through the colors? One is really gray, one is really green, right? That's like the base level of just some simple contextual things. Color, medium, brushstroke, all of that stuff of like, how has it been used and what does it mean as a result? And this is just for art, but for photography as well. It's like, how is it composed? What is the framing of it? And all of those kind of more creative stuff. And we tend to get like actual artists come in and steer this because they're much better at it. Like I'm not going to talk to you about the difference between brush strokes and what it means, right? It's not my field of expertise. But getting someone in who does understand photography or whatever can give you a much more in-depth conversation with those peer researchers. And this is one where young people could put anything up on a wall. I mean, quite helpfully, they usually wrote things as well, so you don't have to do much interpretation. You know what it's about. But some people would just draw things like hands or whatever. That it's for the peer research to understand what that drawing meant and how it relates to all of the other drawings on the wall. And then we saw this last time, which was a tree with roots and problems and recommendations as well. Again, creative approaches sometimes are very qualitative, right? I know it's a nice visualization. I know it's a tree, but fundamentally it is qualitative data. So you just basically collect it, you write up every single sentence on it, and then you just have basically qualitative data to group, sort, and then analyze. So lastly, when you turn those data into key findings, I'm conscious of time, so I'll be a bit quicker. The way to do key findings is synthesize it across all of their data. So we talk about having 10 key findings from the survey, 10 key findings from the interview, 10 key findings from the creatives, and then how do you work them all together, right? For me, a really strong key finding includes one bit of each, right? It has one survey data, it has thematic qualitative data to back up that survey data, and then maybe a creative piece of data that really case studies or exemplifies all of it, right? It's making sure that it has everything. You will have key findings that don't have everything, right? You might not have picked it up in the survey, but it comes out really strong in the qualitative. That's fine as well. But it's just trying to match it across all of them. The one thing I would say as well is in terms of numbers of key findings, people tend to do 10. 10 is generally the target, but I think kind of be limited by how much data you actually have, right? I still think sometimes people overshoot for 10 and it waters it down, and maybe like 7 or 8 and 9 isn't as strong. I think 5 is perfectly fine. Just having 5 really clear, strong, distilled key findings is far better. I see a lot of projects trying to stretch to 10 sometimes, and I don't think necessarily it serves them well when they're trying to do policy impact and influence. Um, and then I think the main thing here is making sure that each finding speaks to that research question, right? So if you ask the research question to the young person, they could say the key finding and it perfectly speaks to that. It's just about making sure that it's coherent and matches up really, really nicely. This is the thing that we use for slightly older groups when it comes to key findings. Like how do you make sure that it's a key finding, which is signal, identify the strength of the signal and what that means quantitatively. We talked about variance of difference. What does that mean qualitatively? So how reoccurring is the theme? Second one is strength check. So within quantitative, it's sample size. In qualitative, it's the amount of times it appears and across different interviews and different focus groups, right? Not just multiple times within the same focus group. Explain the why, right? So why is that the case? Looking at subgroup correlations in the quantitative. With qualitative, it's illustrative quotes or quotes that speak to the subtext and that understanding of the mechanism that they use to get to that point, right? Fourth one's counter check for divergence. You always just counter check, right? Are there any voices? Am I picking and choosing? You know, actually, what does that minority say and why does it exist? And is it quite large and all of that stuff? Just making sure that you feel strong enough to say it. And then lastly, so what? And this is the so what is like, how do you turn it into some sort of recommendation or action, right? So showing the extent to the impact that it would make or the context and the conditions that it needs. Um, and we always turn it into kind of 3 status, right? So we try and get them to think about how you write it in a really, really clear way. So the weak one is just the data dump. It's that thing of percentages and blah, blah, blah. Then this next one is vague statements. So, they're scary, don't like the lighting. The strongest way to write key findings is always to have the clear impact side of it, right? So poor lighting is effectively excluding 1 in 3 young people. It's got the data there. It's got the impact of that result. And it also tells the story, right? So how do you get them to not only write key findings, but it's also teaching them the way in which you write key findings to affect change. Analysis stakeholder as well. Really important to get stakeholders involved. Usually people get stakeholders involved at the end for recommendations, but I think as the analysis, when you have draft key findings, it's really important to get them involved there as well, because they can explain some of the challenges or some of the key findings or why things are the way they are. It doesn't weaken the findings. It brings in additional contextual information, right, that can help the peer researchers understand. There is a challenge between explanation versus excuse, right? Just because a person explains to you that it's because funding is massively cut, it doesn't excuse the key finding if it's really important, but it provides that context and explanation. Generally, we do the sessions in 3 ways. The peer researchers start by presenting with a PowerPoint their findings. Then they have mixed table discussions. So one table will be on the theme of safety, one table will be on the theme of whatever it is. And then the peer researchers will do a discussion with the stakeholders about what surprises them, blah, 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 blah. And at this point of stakeholder engagement, you can start to turn key findings into recommendations as well. So what's that low-hanging fruit? What are stakeholders aware of? What are the gaps? And then already starting to gather some information and ideas for the peer researchers to come up with their recommendations. And then also there's kind of that policy work, right? So thinking about open doors and locked doors. And by that, we mean, trying to have that honest conversation with stakeholders about what are the challenges internally for this change? Like, what are the barriers here? Like, how should things be framed or what are the opportunities? And that's stuff that wouldn't necessarily go in the public facing report, but it's really important for them to think about in terms of how they frame their recommendations. And then lastly, we just always make sure that you protect them from the politics as well, right? You don't want them to be in a session and they come up with these fantastic key findings and they get an earload on structural challenges faced by national government settlements and budgets and blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? So how do you prep them for that? And also how do you work with stakeholders to talk about kind of what the young people are saying, and let's not get too bogged down in these contextual factors or whatever it is. So I'm going to skip ahead because I'm conscious of time. But there are some really good examples of how you do stakeholder engagement, where you bring them in. but designing recommendations is the last section, and I think it's the really important one. So with findings, it's how do you turn those findings into recommendations? We tend to start drafting it within the same thing, but there's a range of ways to go about recommendations, right? So if the finding is young people disengaged after one session, they could think about what they want to do to address that. So 6-week programs or whatever it is. And it's complicated, right? Because it's kind of magic wand stuff. There could be anything. Like, how do you solve a problem like disengagement at a youth club? There's 1,000 different ways and ideas. So you need loads of really structured activities and exercises to get people to do stuff that is actionable and you can actually fight for change on. So the first one is kind of a recommendation triangulation, which is thinking about evidence strength, which is similar to the key findings. How strong is the evidence? What is the practical feasibility? And this is where stakeholders are really important to think about. Do they have the money? Do they have the legal remit? Whatever it is. What's the feasibility of them actually doing this? And then lastly, it's the stakeholder value. Like, what's the desirability or the viability of it? What are the contextual factors? Is there a May election coming up? Is that elected member no longer going to be in place in 3 months, right? Is it one of the mayor's top priorities for 2027, right? It's all of that kind of more political stuff that they might want to think about, to making sure that their recommendations are aligning with long-term funding streams and the strategic opportunities. So one of the things we always say is make it smart. This is the kind of stuff that you learn in secondary school as well. It's that specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time bound. It's that thing where we get every single recommendation they write and we get them to go through how specific is it, how measurable, how achievable, how relevant, and what time bound as well, right? Let's not think about abstracts like when should this be achieved? What do you think a realistic time frame is to do it? So smart, really good way of just kind of narrowing it down. Second one is Sheila McKechnie Foundation Grid. We've used this before, especially with stakeholder engagement. But for those who don't know, it's a grid. Let me find it. Oh, do I have it in here? Yeah. And it's a way of charting different recommendations for different areas of the system, right? So which changes do they want to pitch at a local authority level, at a community level, at a public level, public sphere, and more national government institutions, right? I'll talk about it here. So there's the grid, and you would just chart it, right? So bottom left is service provision. They might have a long-term aim for service provision, and they put their recommendation on a post-it note, bottom left. They might have something short that they could start organizing in their local youth club, like tomorrow, that goes into the community space, right? So it also gets them start charting out their recommendations spatially to think about what are the different parts of society that we're aiming this in, right? If all of their recommendations are bottom left, then they're entirely reliant on the local authority being receptive and taking up their recommendations for them to approve any change. It's really good to kind of have multiple recommendations for different parts of the system, just in case you find that your relationships aren't good enough in one area. You can at least make sure that you're making traction and impact in a different part of community or institutional power. And then yeah, sorry, SMART goals, I put them again. And then the last one is traffic light tests. And this is testing the feasibility of the stakeholders. So this is really important. If you have draft recommendations, go back to stakeholders again. And then it's starting to think about short-term gains, midterm, and then red, right? What are the quick wins? Which ones do you think could be implemented and the peer researchers could help next week with starting to meet people and getting the ball rolling? What's the kind of mid-change stuff that might need more senior sign-off, more work, process redesign, but you're really keen on doing it and stakeholders agree in principle that it's necessary? And what's the really long-term stuff where stakeholders say, no, it's not going to happen, we don't have the funding, right? To be really clear, you want a mix of everything, right? You even want loads of recommendations that are the very challenging things. You shouldn't be limited by how feasible they are, right? But it's making sure that there is a variation across all of them. You don't want loads of unfeasible ones because they will lead to no impact. You don't want loads of green quick wins because then you're not trying to tackle structural inequalities. You're just kind of doing quick, small tinkering around the sides, right? But the only way to gauge whether things are green, amber, or red is by testing with stakeholders, because they will have that kind of structural knowledge to give to your peer researchers about how difficult or easy these things that they want to do are, right? And it's not being bowed by that, but it's understanding that and making far more rich and implementable recommendations as a result. So Last thing I'll say is assigning ownership. This is really important. Sometimes people just do recommendations, and a council can't own a recommendation. An organization can't own it. This is why that stakeholder engagement is really important. So peer researchers don't just go, hey, hopefully this council will take it forward. They go, that guy from Parks that we met, Jonathan, what's his name? We should get him to do that. Like he should be responsible for that. Let's get a meeting with him, right? It's putting faces to names. And so much, not just in the local authorities, generally change is driven by one motivated individual who really gets it or really cares about that specific thing. And having peer researchers do that, understand that, and assign responsibility. So you are responsible for recommendation two and chasing these people for that recommendation, right? Getting them involved, getting them have ownership over the impact of the work as well, thinking about deadlines and capacity, but also really celebrate those commitments, right? Trying to get commitments from stakeholders in the room while they're there, while they're engaged is really important. And then all you're doing is getting the peer researchers to follow up those commitments rather than chase people to make commitments. And also just be really monitoring of it as well. So if a stakeholder consistently defers or doesn't respond, then that's where you as an organization might step in as well to support it. And this is an example of recommendations. This report had recommendations from Merton's Youth Parliament as well. So it was really clear that it came from the youth voice structure within it. And this was the recommendations on the right for House Project as well. So, very clear, a new mental health wellbeing offer supported by young people. And then the paragraph is about why this is the recommendation and what it hopes to achieve as well, a little bit more detail. Recommendations are far less single data points. They're more telling a story. Like, what's the story? Like, what would it achieve? Why is it here? Why is it being recommended? So common integrity risks, and this really is the last bit, is around what are the risks in participatory analysis. We talked about it before, cherry picking comfortable findings, having adults analyze the data before the sessions, doing leading questions in the facilitation of the analysis, right? Like telling young people that this is a really important key finding, over polishing report language as well, trying to make sure that key findings in particular are in young people's language, and they describe it the way that they would describe it to a friend of why it's interesting. Not softening recommendations before sharing to protect stakeholder relationships, right? Just being honest that they're draft and they might be challenging and having that conversation in person. And then claiming co-ownership over the findings, making sure that young people very much understand that analysis is the bit that is the most important part of the research, really to kind of summarize it. And they need to be in control of that process because it will be their name behind it as well. It belongs to them, and therefore the analysis belongs to them as well. And also making sure that reflexivity of practitioners as well. What is your stakes in the findings? And this can be really tricky, especially if you're doing, say, a peer evaluation of a project that you want to be funded again, right? What is your stake, right? What you want the evaluation to go well. You want people to confirm positives. You will probably have an inclination to shy away against negative data. So being like aware of what your organizational priorities are, what your priorities are as an adult as well. You have to be in the room because you have to take them through that. You have to teach them, you have to support them through it. But really, it's about making sure that you're not carrying weight and confirming biases, and you don't have an emotional proximity to the data, right? Same way that a trainer will stand out of the room when people are doing evaluation data. It can be quite difficult for that trainer to go through the evaluation data if it's negative, right? Because it feels personal. So it's about recognizing that, reflecting on that, and ensuring that it doesn't come into the way in which you steer the conversations. There are a bunch of resources and further reading. I will leave it in the group in the PowerPoint, but please have a look at them.